Hello and welcome. My name is Margarethe Richter and I'm Pharma Application Specialist at Thermo Fisher Scientific. I'm responsible for the Twinscrew granulation and extrusion setups used for pharmaceutical applications. And in this talk, I would like to give you a short course or training on how to develop a continuous granulation process. So let's look into Twinscrew processes. Uh, they divide in two different types. First of all, into extrusion, secondly, into granulation. Extrusion basically means that you have a pre-blend or a split feed of your formulation that you feed into a twin screw extruder. The extruder is compounding the material, mixing, kneading, melting the polymer, and kind of mixing the active ingredient into the polymer. And by doing so, you get a solid dispersion in the best case and improve bioavailability here. In the end, you squeeze the material through this bottleneck, and this is the die where you have an increased pressure, and this is where you basically shape the extrudate, so the strand. In the end, you'll have to do a cooling and then pelletization of the material. Typically for oral applications, then you will have milling and a tableting step after that. Granulation is another system or another process based on the same system. So you work with the same machine really. So again, a twin screw extruder is used, but this time we work with an open discharge. So we don't squeeze the material through this bottleneck, but we let the material, easily flow out. And if we have a formulation that is mostly solid, that only has some binder or some liquid added into it, you'll have a agglomeration happening within this twin screw process. Yeah? So along the screws, you mix the materials and you agglomerate them. So you increase the granule size. And after that, if you add a liquid, of course, you will have to do a drying and a tableting step. Let's look into the process in, let's say, real life. So what we have here is a benchtop extruder, Pharma 11 is the name. And we have here a gravimetric feeder that's, in this case, feeding the blend. So the polymer with the active ingredient is fed into this funnel here. And then along the barrel inside here, we can set different temperatures. Yeah, so temperature profile can be set along, and we make this granulation happening along these long screws. In the end, we have this discharge chute, and if we remove it just for visibility, this is what it looks like. You have the screws turning, and this is where the granules come out. The rest happens inside, so it can't be seen in detail. And this is what the granules look like. So you have an increased flowability of your granules based on that process. In this is a melt granulation process. I'll come to the differences in a minute, but you can also add a liquid at any point. So here are different plugs, and you can basically remove a plug and then add a liquid at here or here into the process. And this is really dependent where you do it, influencing the process. The variables that change here or help you to tune your process are basically divided here in independent variables and dependent variables. Independently, you can continuously change the screw speed, so how fast does the screws turn. What's the feed rate, so how much throughput, how much material do I add within an hour, for example, into the extruder. Then the barrel temperature and the temperature profile, and also the liquid to solid ratio. So how much liquid do I add in order to get the granules? Then stepwise, based on disassembly and then reassembly of the setup, you can change the screw design, so the screw configuration. This is really crucial. I'll come to that later, and also the barrel design. Depending on these changes, you'll get results. And these are basically granule temperature, so the temperature will change based on all these settings. The drive torque, so how much does the machine actually have to work to perform the granulation, this will change. Also the residence time of your material within the granulator and the filling level inside the granulator. A twin screw process is never completely filled up, but it has always some void volume, and this of course changes. And then you get, of course, quality control parameters such as dispersion, so how well does the material disperse, how big are the granules, so granule size and distribution changes, and also the granule density. And based on these parameters, you can basically change all this. But let's go through this in the, in the consistent methodology. So this is what I suggest for this talk. We have first of all look into the type of granulation process, into the formulation, then into the setup, and then into the process parameters. So looking into the type of process, well, as mentioned, extrusion and granulation is possible, but granulation also divides into melt granulation or dry granulation, or into wet granulation. If you work without a liquid, so you do a dry or a melt granulation process, then you will have basically a polymeric binder and no water or any other solvent. And you perform the process at elevated temperatures. It doesn't have to be very high, but you can, depending on the temperature, you can talk about melt granulation here. Basically, then you will have temperature above the glass transition of the polymer, but in most cases below the temperature of the API. So you really just melt the binder in this case. This is a very nice process because it's suitable for active ingredients that are sensitive to hydration and also to heat, because the residence time during the granulation process is quite short. So also the residence time at elevated temperatures is short. Then you can work with quite low binder contents, so high dose tablets are possible. And you can enhance solubility if you work with a solubilizing agent, so the polymer can have some solubilizing effect as well. Then higher mechanical energy or mechanical stresses and thermal stresses can occur, of course, so this is a downside of the process. Wet granulation, on the other hand side, is a very common manufacturing route. Typically, it's different techniques that are used, but all of them have in common that there's a solvent, typically water or ethanol, added into the process. If we perform this with a Twinscrew process, then this granulation process is continuous, and this is the big advantage here, for continuous manufacturing. The process itself is performed at low temperatures, so this is a big advantage, but because you add a liquid, you have to dry the liquid afterwards, and you have the solvent handling that needs to be taken care of as well. And if we look into the difference of the melt granulation and solvent granulation, I won't go into too much detail. You can have a closer look at this into this publication. But what you can see based on metformin as an API, they made a case study and they got a lot nicer tablet hardness based on the melt granulation made granules. And the authors state that melt granulation was clearly superior to solvent granulation. So it makes sense to look into it and compare it. Then let's look into the formulation. Well, basically you can have a pre-blend or a solid, a split feed. So you basically feed your solids separately. So let the extruder or the Twinscrew granulator do the work of mixing. Then you can, choose different liquids. Of course, what kind of solvent do we want to work with? And you can add the liquid into the solvent, add the binder into the solvent or into the pre-blend. And this is a question we have discussed in this slide. There's a little bit more in this publication again, but in a nutshell, you get a better distribution and stronger granulation effect, so more effective binder if you add the a binder into the liquid. But you have also the tendency to overgranulate, to make lumps and really large particles and to get quite dense particles. Great, so let's now have a closer look into the setup. Here, feeding is very important, so choose the right feeder, choose the right screws, and even maybe the right hopper. Then also liquid feeding can be quite a challenge, um, especially if you get into this dropping mode and then you're not sure every solid kind of gets enough liquid. So this combination here is crucial. This can be tuned by using the right diameter of a tube for liquid injection and choose, the right plug. So barrel configuration here has an impact. So which position of the ports do I choose in order to add the liquid or the solid? And of course, setup screw configuration is crucial. So let's look into that in detail. This is a really short summary. In a nutshell, if I intensify mixing by changing the screw configuration, that means I can work with these kind of conveying elements, with kind of distributive mixing elements, or even with kneading elements. And here I can change the angle between this kneading elements and thus densify the material in this kneading section quite a lot. So basically, if I change that by increasing either the amount of kneading elements or increasing the offset angle between these kneading elements, I intensify the mixing that way. And by doing so, I get an increase of filling level in the screws, especially in this kneading section. And this will lead to more compaction of the material. The effect is here, of course, we'll get larger granules in average, we'll get more oversized particles, less fines, and we'll get more dense granules. So this is a really brief summary. Of course, there's a lot more details to discuss, but please contact me if you have questions on that. So let's look into the process parameters. Here we have a short case study of a wet granulation process based on mostly a lactose placebo formulation with PVP 30 as a binder and water that is used as a liquid. We checked this on different sizes of extruders, so Pharma 11, 16, and 24, so we could really increase and scale up the process. Gravimetric feeding is used, and we also did some inline measurements of the granules. Here you can see on the right-hand side a process set up on a benchtop where we have basically a Pharma 11 granulator, and I'll also always focus on the granules that are made from the granulator itself, but you can actually directly connect it to a fluid bed dryer. Here we cooperate with GLAD and have a semi-continuous granulation system on a benchtop, and of course to add here the larger systems, so the Pharma 16 and the 24 will always be fully continuous. And if we check all these process parameters, so what's the influence of the process parameters on our granules? You'll see there's quite some impact. Here we have a summary of the throughput and the screw speed. So if we increase the screw speed on the Pharma 11, for example, coming from 0.5 kilogram per hour up to 3.5 is probably challenging. So this is a model based on some trial results we have. You'll see that increasing the throughput will increase the average particle size, so the mean mass diameter. And this is because you basically feed more material into the screws, and by doing so, you basically fill up the screws at a constant screw speed. You fill up the screws more, and this leads to more compaction and larger granules. The opposite happens if you increase the screw speed, so from 100 to up to 900 RPM. If you increase the screw speed, granules get smaller, become smaller in average, because again, the screws empty down more. You have less compaction than happening, and smaller granules result from that process. So basically, the recommendation is if you want to increase the throughput, this should always go along with an increase in screw speed in order to keep the granule size constant. But on the other hand side, you can basically tailor your particle size distribution or your average particle size by changing the filling level here, yeah, based on these two parameters. So these are very important. And in a nutshell, if we look into all these process parameters, if you increase the liquid to solid ratio, basically this happens for all wet granulation processes, you'll get larger particles in average and more dense particles. If you increase the throughput, I mentioned that before, larger particles, even a wider distribution, particle size distribution is wider, and the density is also higher. Then if you increase the screw speed, the opposite happens, smaller granules. If you, but this is, always happening in this several range. There are exceptions of this rule, right? So if you have questions on that, again, don't hesitate to contact me. Then if you increase the amount of mixing, so intensify the mixing by changing the screw configuration I mentioned before again, here you will get, again, larger granules in average and more dense granules. And by increasing the temperature, you also get larger granules because you basically have a more efficient binder for higher temperatures and also more dense granules. So typical errors that happen in Twinscrew granulation, I think this is really, it does make sense to have a closer look into that topic as well. What I see quite often, especially in publications, is that the researchers work with fixed screw configurations. So they have the setup the way it is. They are kind of they hesitate to change anything in the configuration, which is maybe a good start point, but it really limits the design space. So keeping this fixed will limit you a lot, and it makes sense to change the screw configuration and adapt it to what you need, to your formulation. Then again, what you see quite often, this bimodal distribution of granules, and people state that this is due to these two screws and so on. This is, frankly speaking, nonsense. You have a bimodal distribution if you have inaccurate feeding, and especially the ratio of liquid to solid. So if your liquid is not well distributed into the granules, you'll get not a good distribution, and therefore particle size distribution. Therefore, this can lead to an inhomogeneous product, so you get very fine material and then again very large material, but nothing in between. So this is really something to look into. Feeding is very crucial in Twinscrew granulation. And what is also crucial is have a closer look on the cooling and the temperatures on your small scale, because if you then scale up, this can be a problem. Yeah, so it can become a problem if you keep your process not in a good temperature range. And to summarize this, basically all these steps here are step changes. Yeah, so you do trial and then you reassemble everything, change something in the configuration and start again. Whereas everything down here is continuously happening. So you can basically, because you have a continuous process, you can continuously change some of these, let it run for a couple of minutes and you'll see the effect. And if you want to have process optimization, then these can be either made stepwise or continuously. And I have some examples here. So let's say your average granule size is too large. What can I do on a continuous level? Well, that's the simplest thing. Too large granules, well, decrease liquid to solid ratio, and then you'll have, smaller particles. But you can also reduce the filling level in the Twinscrew by decreasing the throughput or increasing the screw speed, and this will also lead to smaller particles in average. Then a step change could be decrease the amount of binder, so change the formulation slightly, And you can also change the screw configuration by decreasing the amount of kneading elements in the zone or decreasing the angle. Another example, if we talk about the particle size distribution, if you have a very wide distribution and many oversized particles and fines and also a pulsing flow of the granules, what can I do about it? Well, you should then, in this case, it makes sense to increase the residence time. So you can imagine if you increase the residence time, the granules have more time for the granulation, you have a bit more back mixing effect, and this will kind of make the system more consistent. Yeah. So you can do this by decreasing the screw speed or the throughput. This both things will lead to a longer residence time. Then stepwise, of course, you can think about the liquid feeding, especially the position of the liquid feeding, and also is the liquid feed optimized? That means, do I have some dropping mode? So this is not really homogeneously coming out of the pump. In this case, it might make sense to work with 2 pump heads, or have several nozzles, or work with a smaller tube. So these things can kind of help you to get a more homogeneous flow of the liquid into the granulation process. And then again, you can adapt the screw configuration. So have a longer kneading section can help you to increase the residence time, or an additional kneading section, and also increase the offset angle can help. There are more details to share, and you can find something in this white paper. You can download it from our webpage. And there are some references worth mentioning, so have a closer look. And with this, I'd like to end my talk. I'm happy to answer questions. And yeah, you can also always write me an email. Thanks for listening.